It's wonderful here to be in Chicago, right? This is the first state anywhere that passed legalization with a vote in the legislature. So also a big thank you to the people of Illinois, to the governor, to the legislature, to the senators, to everybody who helped make that happen, and to the activists who have been working on it for decades. So it's an amazing time of progress and promise and opportunity, excitement in the cannabis industry. And one of the pleasures that I've had lately is getting the opportunity to travel around the world to speak to different cannabis conferences in different countries that are experiencing reform or on the verge of reform. And I recently spent almost the entire month of May in Colombia. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that trip, because it circles right back to this room and to the work that we've been doing together in this room and rooms like this over the course of the past decade. So cannabis has played a very significant role in the history of Colombia for about the last half century. That began in the early 1970s when then President Richard Nixon launched a program called Operation Intercept on the Mexican border. And the idea was to close off the flow of cannabis from Mexico. We all know that that didn't work. But while that was going on, some of the people who had been working the Mexican border, smuggling, the earliest hippie weed smugglers, started looking for an alternative source. And the source that many of them found was the Guajira Peninsula, which is attached to La Sierra de Santa Marta in the northern part of the country of Colombia. That Sierra was the source of some of the finest cannabis that I've ever seen in my life, and was the first cannabis that I ever made money on many years ago. Santa Marta Gold, incredible strain of cannabis. And Santa Marta Gold was really good for me. It was sort of the way that I built my reputation in the underground weed industry way back in the 1970s. But it wasn't so good for the indigenous peoples of that area. There's 117 different indigenous tribes in Colombia, and many of them live in remote areas because they went there to be able to preserve their language, their way of life. And those areas became prime growing and smuggling areas. The problem was that there was already a low-level civil war going on in Colombia. There were already armed factions that were roaming the same remote areas, fighting with each other. And the indigenous, had already been caught in this struggle, but when the cannabis trade started gearing up, because this cannabis that was grown there was so good, and airplanes full of money and boats full of money started landing in Colombia and started this thing called La Bonanza Marimbera. La Bonanza Marimbera, marimba, ganja, marijuana. So that sparked an arms race, this flood of dollars coming into the hands of these arms groups, enabled them to escalate, to buy a lot more weapons. The conflict became a lot more vicious. And it was a time of misery for the indigenous peoples who had been caught in the middle of that. It got even worse in the 1980s. Right? There was another program by the United States, and that was when George H.W. Bush was appointed the head of the South Florida Task Force. At that time, there were these huge freighters that were bringing in the Colombian cannabis. It was coming at a really low price. I used to buy it for like $350 a pound. And George H.W. Bush targeted these large cannabis freighters and took them out of action and made it impossible for people to move anything other than very small, very fast boats. And so a lot of folks converted to cocaine. And that made the arms race and the viciousness of the situation in Colombia even worse. And this war continued until 2016. I did not meet any Colombian person that hadn't been touched by it, who hadn't had to move away from their home, who hadn't had a relative who had been wounded or had been killed or had been raped or had been imprisoned. Hundreds of thousands of people have died there, largely as a consequence of US policies. So in 2016, there's this peace accord that happens in Colombia, and it's still unfolding. But I had an opportunity to meet the man that was the architect of this peace accord, Juan Manuel Galán. And he told me that cannabis and legalization was a really critical part of his thinking about the peace process. What he envisioned was that all of these armed groups that were selling cannabis and coca and buying weapons with them and then claiming territory and fighting for it and killing people would be able to put down those guns, would be able to grow cannabis, manufacture it into products, export it to the countries all around the world that are legalizing cannabis, from guns to buds. And that's a process that's still unfolding in Colombia. I talked to both former paramilitaries and former guerrillas who had, in fact, came into the cannabis industry and stopped fighting. And that process is far from perfect, right? I saw a lot of flaws that's still being worked out. But the conflict areas are de-escalating. Right? Former combatants are dropping their weapons and starting to tend to cannabis. Cannabis ventures, large and small, are sprouting all over Colombia. A huge export trade is gearing up to supply all of the European countries that have legalized cannabis for medical purposes, like Germany, where cannabis will now be distributed through their National Health Service. So Galán's theory is being proven right. And I had an opportunity to meet with Galán when I was there in Colombia. We had this amazing, great meeting. We really just clicked. And Galán is a remarkable guy and has a really remarkable story, a remarkable journey with cannabis, a tragic journey with cannabis like so many other Colombians, or cannabis related, or underground related. So his journey started in 1989 when his father, the senior Galán, was assassinated. And you may have seen a recreation of this assassination yourselves on Narcos. This is the presidential candidate that was assassinated by Pablo Escobar. So many of you have probably seen that. And we exchanged thoughts, Galán and I, and later in the day, I had the opportunity to speak on the same stage as him, and he came on after me, so I had an opportunity really to be out in the audience and fully absorb what he was saying. And I was really moved because there was a moment where Juan Manuel Galán, Senator Juan Manuel Galán, architect of the Colombian peace process, stood up and he said that the legalization of cannabis is una luz de esperanza. Una luz de esperanza, which translates in English to a light of hope for Colombia. And I wanted to share this story with you because that light of hope, that luz de esperanza, was lit in large part by many of you who are sitting in this room, who put your dollars and your minds and your skill and your sweat behind creating this industry. Because I'll tell you, Galán made it very, very clear to me. He never would have been able to do what he did in Colombia if we had not already accomplished what we have here today. So I want to end with a thank you to all of you who have been a part of this process over the course of the last decade, who have seen this vision that Troy and I had of a active, politically engaged, profitable cannabis industry, and the idea that that industry could power reform not just in the United States, but all around the world. And today, because of our efforts, what we all have done together, that vision is a reality in more and more countries all around the world, right? Today, cannabis is legal in many places. Tomorrow, it will be legal in many more places. And one day, it will be legal everywhere.